as well. And what I might add is that as we craft the application for this $250 million, we've actually asked for the help of the Chancellor's Office and the Workforce Investment Board to craft that application. So we're trying to demonstrate from a state perspective that these three state agencies have come together in a collaborative effort to at least craft the application for you. And actually, all three state agencies will be involved in the scoring of those applications as well. So I hope that's a strong message to you from the state perspective. And I don't know earlier, did I introduce myself? I don't know that I did. Russ Weichel, I'm the Division Director of the Career College Transition Division of the California Department of Education, Antelope Valley. So, born and raised in Hanford. I think there's a green V on the back of my neck. And actually, worked in Kings County Unified District in Reedley for 20 years before moving on. And actually a product of Harvard West campus, Fresno State. So, dog. That's my background. Just thought I'd let you know. So, talking about Harvard, our next moderator is Bob Swartz, Professor Emeritus of Harvard Graduate School, and we're having Nancy Hoffman will be joining him in the second half of the presentation, or actually she'll take over the second half, I guess, is the way we're doing it, and present and give you some data and really look at kind of an international and national perspective on what we've been talking about. So this time I'll welcome Bob.
Well, Adelina is setting this up. So I'm from Harvard East. I have no Valley credits, but I do have a little bit of California credit, which is, you'll notice in my bio, it said I began my career as a high school English teacher. That happened to be in California, in the San Rafael district. And I have consequently followed education developments, the ups and downs of California as the economy has gone up and down, and policies have really moved around. But I have to say, Nancy, who is a vice president at a nonprofit based in Boston called Jobs for the Future, 90 people strong, 30-year history, heavily focused on education in the workforce, mostly focused on low-income young people and adults. We co-lead a national network of now 9 states, which California is a member. Almost lost the computer here. And I have to say, I think the developments here are more exciting than any other state that we are working in. There's certainly no other state that is looking at an open, quite flexible new fund like the Career Pathways Fund to support this kind of collaborative work that we just heard about from our panel. And I have to say, I don't think there's another state that we're working in that has such strong leadership across the sectors as this one does. And I haven't yet met anywhere else a legislative leader like Senator Steinberg who has been as intensely focused on this set of issues. We're incredibly lucky to have this kind of leadership here. We're going to divide this presentation. I in 2011, with 2 colleagues at Harvard, published a report called Pathways to Prosperity. It kind of laid out an argument for why it is as a nation that we really need to pay much more attention to getting a better balance between the strictly academic purposes in education and the career and civic purposes. And when you issue one of these reports, and I've been involved in lots of reports over a long career, you never know at the time you release your report whether or not it's just going to kind of sink like a stone, or whether or not it's going to kind of strike enough of a nerve to get a pickup. And we were really lucky in terms of timing, but the report really did kind of catch a wave. And over the next year, one of my 2 colleagues, a former reporter named Bill Simons, basically spent a year on the road just responding to requests from organizations all across the country for presentations on the report. We wrote the report basically to put a big problem on the table. And I'm just going to run through a few data slides to quickly kind of lay out the problem. And then we basically said, we resisted the temptation to end the report with a long laundry list of recommendations specifying, here's what the federal government should do, here's what the state should do, because we really wanted the report to prompt a conversation. And I think that's what's happened, and consequently, over the next 6 or 9 months, leaders from a variety of states kept coming to us and saying, okay, you convinced us of the problem, help us figure out what to do. As Senator Steinberg said, this is really new work. It's not as if, yes, we have some international experience to draw on. You're going to hear in Nancy's part of the presentation some of the things we've learned. Between the two of us, we've had the opportunity over the last 4 or 5 years to visit high-quality vocational systems, Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, Australia, Singapore. Systems that are very different. Some of them mostly work-based, some of them mostly school-based, but there are some common elements and common ingredients that we really think that the U.S. can learn from and figure out how to adapt. And so we're going to hear from Nancy in the second part of the presentation, both about what we think can be learned internationally and how that work has kind of fed into the network that we've been building as we've been working with states like California. So let me just kind of quickly start with a few of the key kind of data points that really drove the report. So this is a profile of the sort of education level of the U.S. labor force. This is ages 25 to 64, but one of the things that's striking is that if you just look at kind of the 25-year-olds in terms of the educational level, it's about the same as this overall profile. So roughly, you add percentage of young people or percentage of folks in the workforce with bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees. We've now got it up to about 32 or 33%. We've actually been making some progress over the last 5 or 8 years. It's gone from kind of 27, 28% up to 32%. Not something to be dismissed. Roughly another 10% had 2-year degrees, and roughly another 12% have a 1-year vocational certificate that actually has some currency or value in the workplace. That gets you only to a little bit more than half of the population. And again, our focus has been particularly on 25-year-olds. But if you think for a minute, kind of roll the tape back and think about our kind of rhetoric over this period of time. We have been saying, for the last 20 years, we've been making the case that why it is that we need all young people not simply to complete high school, but to go on to college. And for most Americans, when you say college, they tend to think about 4-year college. If you ask high school seniors what proportion of you are going on to college after graduation, 90% will say they are. In fact, if you survey young people in October following their high school graduation, roughly 2 out of 3 are enrolled in some form of post-secondary education. But if you ask the hard question at age 25, what proportion of young people have either a 4-year degree, a 2-year degree, or a 1-year credential, it's just barely over 50%, which raises a rather large question. What is our strategy as a country or as a state for equipping the other half of young people with the knowledge and skills and credentials and work experience they need in order to get successfully launched into adult working life? One of the things that's really striking about the U.S. in contrast with every other developed nation that we've been to at least, is that we have no formal system for helping most young people make a successful transition from the end of kind of compulsory schooling to the beginning of working life. So for us at least, this career pathway model is a really important strategy. We're really trying to sort of ramp up our game. If you look at that same slide for California, the numbers are roughly the same, but again, really just under 40% with a 2 or 4-year degree. I think it's fair to guess that maybe another 10 or 12% at least, maybe even larger, have some college, but no degree, and some fraction of those probably have 1-year occupational certificates of value. But so it just tells you kind of what the challenge is for us kind of moving forward. Kind of stand back a bit and ask what's been happening in terms of the U.S. education looked at comparatively over the last 5 decades. This is now we're focusing on high school graduation rates. This was interesting. In the 1960s, the U.S. on the far left-hand column in the slide led the world in the proportion of young people with a high school diploma. 1970s, you can see some other countries began to catch up. 1980s, 90s. The case of South Korea. In 4 decades, moving from 27th place in this international comparison of high school proportion of young people with a high school diploma to first place. The U.S. basically, an important point is the U.S. basically stands still. It's not as if, I'm not someone who believes that, we once had this great education system and that somehow, we've fallen into deep decline. The big part, the message here is that other countries have discovered what we discovered, a half a century ago, which is it really is important to get larger and larger fractions of your young people, at least through secondary education, with a core foundation of knowledge and skills that they've been making, deep investments, and we're now beginning to see those investments pay off. So we're obviously no longer in an advantaged position where we can say we have the largest proportion of at least high school educated students in the world. Others have caught up and surpassed us. We're in the middle of the pack. The good news that slide ended in the 1990s. The good news is in the last decade, actually, we're now beginning to see some modest upticks, not only in our overall graduation rates, but I would argue even more important, the racial gap in high school graduation is really beginning to narrow. The two bottom lines reflecting African American and Latino kids, there is progress to report. We're now almost up to 80%. Looked at across racial groups. We still have room to improve, obviously. In higher education, again, I think this is less well known. In one decade, 1995 to 2005, the U.S. fell in comparative terms from second place to 15th place. And again, the message is it's not that that we were declining. We were standing still while other countries were really ramping up their investments. Obviously, that was 2005. In the last 7 or 8 years, because we've had this focus on increasing our college admission rates, our numbers are beginning to edge up. But still, we're now still roughly in the middle of the pack. As you might guess from the comments I made earlier about the proportion of kids saying they're going out to college and actually going up, a big problem here is college completion. We are, as you can see, only 59% of those who start a 4-year college degree actually complete within 6 years. Of first-time, full-time students entering community college seeking degrees, only less than a third complete within 3 years. In California in particular, again, because of the enormous challenges that this state has faced in the last few years especially around funding, if you look back slide. What you see, this is comes from a report that Nancy Shulock, who runs a research center connected to Sacramento State, focuses on higher education system here in the state. This is tracking over a kind of 6-year period of what happens to a cohort of young people in the community college system. And as you can see, if the focus is on proportions of people completing with either a certificate or a vocational 2-year degree, you've got really vanishingly small numbers of successful completers. A huge problem that collectively we're going to have to figure out how to address. And again, I have enormous sympathy for the community college sector in California in the sense that what you've got is institutions that have been overrun with adults returning for more education, more skills, and a system that has been historically way under-resourced compared to the challenges and the goals and the expectations we have for that system. And I hope as the California economy recovers and bounces back that we're going to start to see some significant changes in that. But this is a huge problem with what we're trying to collectively accomplish here. And now I want to shift and look through the other end of the telescope. So far we've been talking about what's happening on the supply side, if you will. That is the numbers of people, portions of people coming through with successful qualifications. One reason that I think we were successful in convincing young people and their families about the importance of post-secondary education is that we've been hearing for at least 2 decades from economists, credible economists, that the middle was hollowing out of the U.S. economy, and that we were moving into a world in which there really were only going to be 2 kinds of jobs: high-wage, high-skilled jobs requiring at least a 4-year degree, if not more, and low-wage, low-skilled jobs that the rest of us were going to be consigned to that didn't give you enough income to or have enough of a career path to be able to move on to the middle class. Well, in the last few years, there's been a kind of counter revolution, if you will, or at least a set of economists who are basically saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not what we see out there. What we see looking ahead for at least the next 10 or 15 or 20 years is a very significant chunk of jobs, probably maybe even as high as 30% or so, jobs that really are in this kind of middle skill category. Jobs that will require, yes, absolutely a high school education and some education or training beyond high school. Good jobs that typically have a strong kind of STEM foundation to them, but not necessarily jobs that require a 4-year degree. The challenge is, how do we really kind of close the gap, if you will, and start to align our education system to be able to make sure that, as the Chancellor said a few minutes ago, there in the Valley here, you've got, and nationally, as you'll see in a minute, we've got this strange phenomenon. Millions and millions of people out of work, while at the same time we've got good jobs going begging because of the so-called skills or education mismatch. Here are some examples of the kinds of middle skill jobs and their numbers. In the computer field, obviously computer support specialists, electrical technicians in the engineering field. In healthcare, just a huge number of jobs coming from Boston. Obviously, the healthcare sector is very strong in our economy. And as you can see, production. And these are just some quick examples. I couldn't resist bringing with me the front page of the business section from the Boston Globe this past Sunday. Big story called The Great Mismatch. Unemployment remains vexingly high despite a slew of job openings. The reason? Workers often lack skills that new positions demand. In healthcare, the state's healthcare industry has thousands of job openings, with some individual hospitals needing hundreds of workers, both with and without college degrees, industry officials say. The booming life sciences sector, including biotech, has plenty of jobs available, and not just for scientists with PhDs. Hundreds of full-time lab technician positions, which don't require college degrees, are going unfilled. Even manufacturing, which is yet to fully recover from the recent recession, is experiencing acute shortages within certain fields, especially for workers trained to run sophisticated computerized machinery. Now, that happens to be Massachusetts. This economy overall is pretty strong, but we go in and out of lots of metropolitan regions and hear similar kinds of stories. There's a center at Georgetown University on education and the workforce that's been producing a really terrific stream of reports on these topics over the last several years. And one of the findings that has really kind of struck me is that while it remains true that in the aggregate, the more education you have, the better off you are in this economy, and certainly you want to encourage all people to go on and get as much education as they can. We're now beginning to see significant overlaps in terms of the economic returns to different kinds of degrees. So in a sense, it no longer matters quite as much how many years of education you've had as what the skills are, what you know and can do with the education you've got. So, for example, here, three data points. 43% of young workers with licenses and certificates earn more than those with a 2-year degree. 27% of young workers with licenses and certificates earn more than those with a 4-year degree. And I think most important for our purposes, we're now seeing nearly 1 in 3 workers with an associate degree out-earning those with a bachelor's degree. One statistic that I don't think has quite caught up with the general public yet, although I think it's part of the reason that people are now beginning to pay more attention to career and technical education, is that among 4-year degree holders under the age of 25, something like 40% of them are actually working in jobs that didn't think of historically as requiring a 4-year college degree. Now, a lot of that obviously has to do with the recession we're just coming out of and with the conditions in the larger economy. But an awful lot of it also has to do with the fact that young people, because we pay so little attention to career information, advising, exposure, we have an awful lot of young people who kind of leave high school, drift into a four-year institution because that's where the social expectations are for them from their families, don't have enough knowledge about the relationship between what they study and what kinds of job opportunities are open to them, and then find themselves with a boatload of debt, unfortunately, average debt $27,000, and often pretty weak career prospects. And to come back to the so-called middle skills category, I think this is an interesting point here. Just pretty recently, the Brookings Institution in Washington, highly respected policy think tank center, issued a report on the STEM fields and basically pointed out that roughly half of the STEM jobs, again, we often think, oh, STEM, that means, scientists and engineers, roughly half of the jobs in the STEM field are in this middle skill category, not necessarily requiring a four-year college degree, and the average salary associated with these so-called middle skill STEM jobs, $53,000. And this is obviously, these are in fields that are growing. In California, to bring this home a bit, so we've got roughly 1.4 STEM-related jobs for every unemployed person, and as against nearly 5 unemployed people for every job in fields that are not kind of STEM-focused or STEM-based. As I mentioned earlier, so we've got this odd kind of mismatch problem nationally: 14 million people looking for work, 3 million jobs looking for people. Just the last couple of slides. Actually, I think the reason that Nancy and I were invited to come join in this California Roadshow that the department is putting on is because Russ and Lupita and Christopher Cavalden and Susanna Cooper from Senator Steinberg's office were among the kind of delegation from California that came to participate in an institute that we hosted for state teams and regional teams from the states that we're working with in this Pathways Network. This was back in October. And in many ways, one of the highlights of that institute was a presentation by a Boston-based economist named Andy Sung, who runs a center on labor market studies at Northeastern University, a Boston-based university. Andy may be the country's kind of most persistent economist who really studies the problems that young people face in this economy on the employment front. And he really gave a powerful, dramatic, passionate presentation pointing out to us that the young people are at most risk in this economy than has been true really ever since the Great Depression in the late 30s. The youth labor market, as we've known it traditionally, has basically dried up. Access to work for teenagers and young people has really shrunk dramatically. One evidence of this, these are the employment to population ratios just between 2000 and 2012. You can see this dramatic decline. 45% of young people having any kind of employment whatever, down to just barely more than 1 in 4. If you really want a scary number for those of you in this state, if you look at the metropolitan areas, the 10 metropolitan areas in the country with the highest proportion of young people having access to work, teenagers, and then the 10 lowest, the worst places in the country for young people's access to work, half of those 10, 5 of the 10 are metro regions in this state, including obviously Fresno right here. One last statistic on the youth employment front, and this I think is a really, really sobering one. Again, in the beginning of the century, in 1999 and 2000, if you compare the employment ratios of 16 and 17-year-old males as against 68 to 75-year-old males, obviously at the beginning, it shouldn't surprise us at all, but more than twice as many 16 and 17-year-olds were actually working. Again, working in this definition means having some access to some work, working at least a day in the month that these figures have taken. Twice as many young people were working as old people. Now, 2011, 2012, those figures have reversed, and we now have a higher percentage, 68 day. In the month that these figures have taken, twice as many young people were working as old people. Now, 2011, 2012, those figures have reversed, and we now have a higher percentage of 68 to 75-year-olds working than we do teenagers, just at the point when people should be beginning to think about, getting started in the labor market. As somebody who's contributing to this problem in that age range, I'm probably an exception in that I am choosing to work. But obviously, what these figures reflect in part is the fact that in this recession, a lot of people who have been planning on retirement have been unable to afford it because of what's happened to their pension funds or their savings. But if you ask yourself, as a society, does this, how will we allow this to happen? Where, in fact, the people who worked a lifetime and in a sense are owed retirement are unable to do it, and the young people who most need support from the society to get themselves launched into adulthood with access to work and work experience are being denied it. For me, one of the big messages from the youth employment data is that if we can't figure out a way, educators and employers together, to organize access to some form of work experience to help young people develop, especially the kind of softer skills that you can only get from access to work that you can't get sitting in classrooms, learning how to work in teams, the importance of workplace expectations, showing up on time, being able to take instruction, being able to take initiative. If we can't get virtually all young people some opportunity to develop those skills while they're still in school, they're not going to be able to get that experience on their own. That's the big message, that this labor market really has dried up for young people. And as you might guess, the poorer you are, and for young kids of color, especially males, the situation is really, really grim. On that happy note, I'm going to ask Nancy to come out and
the slides array,
yeah,
along with the podiums. We're going to try to
So, this is Nancy Hoffman.
One of us is Nancy Hoffman.
Not both. This is Emily Garcia, who also works on Jobs for the Future and has been saving our life.
Thank you. Okay. I'll hold on to it. Okay, so I am delighted to be here, and it's really, really exciting for us to see this state with its huge population and very youthful population engaged in such exciting work and really building on a set of resources that have been there and at work despite the fact that there's been major economic challenges across the country, but in California particularly. Before I get started, I just wanted, I had one comment that came really from the question that Christopher Gabaldon was asking about why work in regions or how to work in regions. And since I know many of you are here thinking about, not us, but the $250 million, I wanted to just say a word about regions. And it's the following. My organization, Jobs for the Future, does a great deal of work on regional economies. And one of the things that we do as we define regions is look at the transportation patterns. And it might be useful to you as you think about your region to think about where it is that the public transportation and car and bus transportation can get you. Because when we look at local job markets, that's one of the things we do. So the way the Census Bureau defines a region, the way a WIB defines a region may be different from what the transportation patterns are, and those are particularly important as you think about entry-level jobs for young people, since they are the ones that probably have the least resources to get from one place to another. So that's just a footnote to the earlier conversation. So I am going to, Bob really sort of anchored us to the U.S., to the ground in the U.S. and defined the challenges and the problem. I am going to ask you to take a little trip across the ocean with me to Switzerland and the Netherlands, and more generally to what we call the strong vocational education systems. And I'm going to talk about what it really means to have a system, which we don't really have in the United States. We have many programs. But before we do that, I want to just sort of set a context. This is a nice quote from Henry Levin, who's a professor at Columbia. But I think the main thing is that we don't expect that California is going to turn into Switzerland. In fact, Switzerland is about a fifth the size of California, so you might think of a large county in California as the size of Switzerland and the Netherlands. But we do think that it's important as you begin thinking about this access to this new pot of money, which really requires that you have a new vision for how we do career pathways and engage employers. We do think it's important to give you a sense of what a vision might look like and raise some new questions for you. So that's really the purpose of all of this. So before we move on to what the system actually looks like, I want you to take a look at this slide, which comes from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, same source as some of the data that Bob showed you. And take a look at which are the countries that have the lowest youth unemployment. They're all circled down there on your left, and include Austria, the Netherlands, Japan, Germany, and Switzerland, while the U.S. is just about in the middle. And the reason that that the data shows that those systems down on the left have low youth unemployment is they actually think about the purposes of an education system in a different way than we do. They think that you go to school, mostly all school, from, say, age 6 or 7 to age 14 or 15. Then you spend 3 years actually mixing school and work and learning to work, which is not something that we think about as the purpose of our upper secondary schools or our high schools. And then by age 20 or so, if you want to, you go on further in education, but you also can transition into the labor market. So those countries down there at the end all have very strong vocational education systems, and actually only 2 choices at age 15. One is you go into the vocational system, the other is that you go into a highly academic track. Before we go any further, though, I want to just say there are a bunch of myths about European vocational education, some of which actually apply incorrectly to the U.S., to strong vocational programs here in the U.S. as well. But the European systems, which you've probably heard about, you probably think that it's still the case that kids are asked to make choices at age 12 or younger about, and in fact they don't make choices, they're essentially assigned to a track. Not the case any longer. And as you'll see, what did I just do here? That the best systems really are permeable and there's lots of career advancement. In fact, if you've paid attention to PIAC, the assessment of adult learning that just was released by the OECD, you'll see that a number of the countries I mentioned have very, very strong adult learning that goes on throughout the lifetime. And so career advancement is part of that. With the exception probably of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth countries, there are real guards that come from the government in these strong systems about making them too narrowly serve the interests of employers. And as you'll also see, many of these systems have transitioned from the old trades, which are still very important and lucrative, I might say, but to include the modern 21st century occupations, and we'll talk about some of those. Finally, I think there are 2 things that we tend to think about vocational education here and in Europe, and that is that they're for those kids, not our kids, and nothing could be further from the truth, as you will hear. So when we talk about European models and strong ones, what do they look like? There are really 2 kinds of systems, school-based and the apprenticeship system, or what's called dual system. the dual system, you have a mix of work and school, but the employer is really the center of your life, and you sign a contract at age 15 or 16, often signed by your parents as well, with an employer. Usually 3 or 4 years to completion, and I like this quote, school is not the center of the world. Any of you who have 15-year-olds in your household might appreciate the fact that most 15-year-olds would prefer to be out in the world rather than in school all day. In the school-based systems, there is also considerable preparation for work, and there may be a 6-month requirement of internship, a lot of job shadowing early on, or, as in Norway, 2 years of vocational schooling followed by 2 years of apprenticeship. But in any case, young people are in this position of learning how to be workers and experiencing workplaces. I think the thing that might startle you is the fact that in these countries, not just the Netherlands and Switzerland, but Germany, Austria, Sweden, Korea, in general, at least half of the young people choose the vocational system. And what that means is that it's really only in places like Switzerland and Austria, those young people who know at 15 that they want to be research scientists or perhaps join the ministry, who go into, or be philosophers who go into the academic track. The mainstream system is the one that isn't really, in my view, a vocational system, but an applied learning system. And it also, one of the things that makes it very attractive is that it results in a standardized qualification. In other words, if you've got an IT support desk qualification or a networking qualification, you can take that anywhere in the country and increasingly throughout the European Union, and every employer knows what it means and knows what the competencies are. So moving along, the new vocational education is really of very high value to students. I mentioned already that the pathways are permeable. That means you can switch between tracks, and you can, once you finish your initial qualification, go on further, and we'll take a little look at what that means. I've talked a little bit about the fact that it's applied learning, and increasingly the new vocational education, even in the old trades, required what we call STEM competencies, the ability to do mathematics, to use sophisticated IT technology, and to function in a high-tech world. I notice now that when even the person who comes to read our meters at home has a computer, the guy who fixed our leaking sewer pipe did it looking at the technology. So these are increasingly important competencies. I want to just say one word, though, about why it is so significant that these systems are really, really supportive of adolescent development. And that is, if you go to a factory or you go to an insurance company or a banking institution like Credit Suisse that I'm going to talk about in a moment, where they have 750 16 through 19-year-olds in their workforce as apprentices, what you'll see is an enormous number of very patient, supportive adults who really take great pride in transitioning young professionals, as they're called, into adulthood and into their occupations. So these are just a quick picture, but we took a group of people to Switzerland from the Pathways states, and we visited this Center for Young Professionals in Banking in Zurich. And you see here a little bit of what it looks like. It was a wonderful modern building, an old warehouse that had been rehabbed, and you can see how casual these young people are, sitting around learning the basics of the banking industry. So when I say permeable, this is kind of a neat graphic that responds to, I think, the way young people think about their worlds. And the three institutions in the foreground are the schools school, the Center for Young Professionals, and the bank, where young people would spend some of their time each week. But then you can see there are multiple pathways to various kinds of careers. On the far right, in the upper corner is a University of Applied Learning, a higher education technical institution. And what I really like is the little helicopter going across from there to the university, which is in the middle, and getting you a PhD. So as you can see, there are multiple ways you can move from the vocational system into higher education, generally with the requirement that you do some work along the way, because the educators know that people who've had experience in a workplace bring a much more critical mind and framework to more additional schooling. I wanted to just mention the Center for Young Professionals a little bit further, because one of the huge challenges that you face in California and that we face across the country is that what holds these systems together, and sometimes not fully appreciated, are what we call intermediary organizations. Tim Rainey mentioned them earlier today, and we've had a lot of conversation about them. Later on in the breakout session, the Boston Private Industry Council, which is, I'd say, the finest intermediary in the country, Josh Bruno from there will be leading a workshop. In Switzerland, there are sector organizations which are financially supported by combinations of companies in an industry. So this Center for Young Professionals is supported by the banking industry, and it provides the entry-level work. So students would spend 30 days a year at the Center for Young Professionals. They would have a coach. They would have access to all the cutting-edge technology. You might be amused to know that in English, if you went to the German or French versions of the Center's website, you would find language about constructivist approaches to education, a term which many of you in the education field would know. The result, however, is while we get an excuse from employers often here, the ones who are the good ones who do want to invest in training, they often say, but if I do invest, I don't want my next door neighbor taking that person who's away from me. But when the sector organizations are the unit and the training is done collectively, the companies actually encourage an apprentice to move to another company because they know they'll get somebody back who's just as good, and cross-pollination, as long as they don't give away too many company secrets, is considered a plus, not a minus. So I see we are a little bit behind time, so I'm going to just be quick here because I know you have the PowerPoint and just point to a couple of interesting issues here. So the quality markers, I think you can understand. I want to say a word about the issue of how governments and the social partners, that is unions and employers and educators, manage the supply-demand issue, which we haven't even really begun to think about in a systematic way in this country. That is, how do we, if we could have work-based learning, how do we ensure that the places that are available meet labor market needs? So I know you can't read this from where you are, and you probably can't read the slide as well, but I'll tell you what this is all about. This is an apprenticeship barometer from the Netherlands, and in your upper right is a little map of the Netherlands, and quarterly data is collected by these, what are called centers of excellence, that are essentially employer educator support centers in each of the regions of the Netherlands. Collect this data and keep an eye on the relationship between supply and demand. In the middle, there's a kind of dark line that goes all the way across, and that's graphic designers. So clearly the demand for them is high in all regions. Down toward the bottom, you'll see the travel industry, and my guess is, even though I don't know the regions very well, that the blue is about travel to the Amsterdam or The Hague or one of the tourist sites, and the yellow, where there are fewer opportunities, are probably the rural sites. And the government can provide some incentives for employers to create more opportunities if they anticipate that even though they're not needed now, they may be in the future. So what are the national policies that support these systems? First of all, there's a legal framework, usually a vocational education law that spells out the roles of all of the partners. The government's role is to ensure that the young person comes away owning their skills, that they're broad enough so that they can be moved from place to place, and actually broad enough so that you can take them from one industry to another. The state and industry together support intermediaries. And then what might surprise you is these countries give a very strong message to young people, which is, it is not all right not to be in school and not to have a job. You need to be doing one or the other or both together until you transition into the labor market. And those are called youth guarantees or social compacts. And a number of countries have them, some with some punitive removal of support benefits at the same time as the young person is being transitioned back into schooling and work. I should say a big difference in these countries from the U.S. is that post-secondary education is free. So if you're told, get thyself back into school, you don't need a lot of money to do it, you just need the will and the support. Finally, on these European systems, I just wanted to explain to you a little bit about how, at least in Switzerland, the system is essentially not just paying for the employer's contribution, but making money over 3 years or 4 years for the employers who support the training. So this is a slide from an economist who studies these systems. And basically what he's showing you here is on the far left, you see below the horizontal line, in year one, a 4-year apprenticeship actually costs, and those are euros down the vertical, costs the company, while a 3-year apprentice, who probably doesn't need the same level of technical skills, is already beginning, because he or she is given real work, to make a contribution to the bottom line in the company. By year 3, you can see that the 4-year apprentice is making a major contribution, to the bottom line, and the 3-year apprentice is making one too, not quite as substantial, but you see the averages on the far right. So essentially, what employers don't seem to see in this country is that done well, giving young people not make work but real work, which most of them really jump into quickly, is a way of really gaining for the bottom line in the company, not ending up with a deficit. So we're going to jump ahead here, and I'm going to just say a little bit about the way in which some of these ideas are being adapted in the U.S. This graphic, which is very simple, really represents the key levers in the Pathways to Prosperity states, of which California is one. And I think that when the RFA comes out and in the 1070 legislation, you will see levers similar to these that you'll need to pay attention to as you think about your application. I think the one thing, and this is certainly true from my conversations yesterday in a similar setting, that is really going to be new is moving from the piecemeal concurrent enrollment, partnerships that ebb and flow between community colleges and high schools, to really deep integration and alignment of pathways so that young people can start their career pathway, as Senator Steinberg laid out, in high school with the knowledge, even in this impacted community college system, that they will have priority if they come into community college with some courses already completed, particularly I would suggest college math and a career course, and that there will be a space for them in a high demand program. Some of the challenges that we've seen across the country are ones that I think you are going to be and are already addressing in some ways in California. I would say the two that are probably the biggest challenges are the are having intermediary organizations that make the work for employers and for teachers on one side and the other easier because they can aggregate work-based learning opportunities, and as important, deal with the cultural differences and language differences between the business world and the education world. I think it's really one of the big things that I'm sure if you've worked as an educator with employers or an employer with schools and community colleges that you will know is time is a very different entity in business as in higher education. I remember I served as the vice provost for undergraduate education for a number of years at Temple University in Philadelphia, huge school, and we had partnerships that ran out of my office with a number of schools. And I had a very big struggle with the schools. They would call and say, we'd like someone to come and teach a college course next week on X or Y for our high school students. And I would have to say, it usually takes about 2 years for us to approve a new course. Or can you give us an auditorium for next week? And on the other side, employers work on a very quick time schedule and can't, and often plan further ahead than in some ways, and can't respond to requests very, very quickly. So I would say that and employer engagement are the two major challenges, along with the not insubstantial challenges of career advising and pathways design. A word more about intermediaries, and Josh Bruno will be talking more about this in the breakout session. But if you take a look across the small literature on intermediaries and the experience in California and other places across the state, what you need are these kinds of roles in an organization that's a go-between. Perhaps most important, the leading and convening all of the parties, and secondly, brokering and aggregating work-based learning opportunities. In our work across the country, we've done deep mapping of assets in about 22 regions in 8 states, including California. So we're not suggesting to you that these are the only pathways, but as you're thinking about pathways that have major sub-occupations within them where demand is high, if you remember the data from Bob, you will probably come out with similar career areas of focus. And I will say, within California and elsewhere, you don't need to reinvent. There is very strong curriculum in many school examples, particularly in healthcare, beginning in information technology. Not many of them align well from high school through an AA, an associate's degree, but building there. Advanced manufacturing is probably the least well articulated, and we would love, as you do your work, to collect your examples and use them across the country as we reshore a great deal of our manufacturing again. So, let me just see. Wrong direction. What did I do? I just go back. Right from current slide. Okay. I'm almost at the end anyway. So. So just a couple of examples that might be interesting to you. Hampton County, Massachusetts, which is a rural-ish area, is starting an advanced manufacturing pathway that is really supported heavily by a gubernatorial initiative to create stronger career pathways in these 3 sectors that we just mentioned, with an initial focus on bringing manufacturing back to Massachusetts. What we discovered is there are many boutique manufacturers in Western Mass, small companies that are doing extremely interesting high-end work, and they are really lacking for workers, and they are the places where young people can get some really substantial training. So in partnership with the Technical Community College, and a very strong workforce investment board with a long history of working with youth. These folks are often running with an initial cohort in the comprehensive high school where there was practically no career programming left, with a group of 9th graders now starting in advanced manufacturing. Apparently the news hasn't reached California, but at least from the East Coast through to the Midwest, there's been a lot of attention to P-TECH schools. They are partnerships in technology, early college high schools. There is one in New York City which builds on the Early College Initiative, which are these small schools, which you have about 40, 45 or so in California, combining high school with 2 years of college. The difference in P-TECH is that it is sponsored by IBM. It includes a year apprenticeship, so it's a 6-year program, and students are promised to be first in line at IBM or one of its supply chain companies once they complete the program. So taking the best of career academies and early colleges and adding on a really substantial workforce development opportunity and a job at the end of the rainbow. Lots and lots of attention. President Obama mentioned P-TECH in his State of the Union speech, and this recent Youth Careers Connect RFA called SGA, I think, by the Labor Department, also is built on some of the principles of early college and P-TECH. And then finally, something you may want to take a look at in terms of sector organizations. Illinois has formed public-private partnerships around sectors, somewhat similar in spirit to what I was talking about in the European systems. And these are called learning exchanges. They've actually done something that is probably a little bit of sleight of hand, but instead of calling their race to the top funds using them for CTE, which is what they're really doing, they're calling them STEM, which in some ways takes away some of the unfortunate stigma. These learning exchanges are, the ones up and running are advanced manufacturing, health careers, and IT. And they are aggregating materials, providing professional development, and connecting employers in schools across Illinois. They're all open source, and you may want to explore them. So finally, why now? So I mentioned a couple of issues, and I think the only thing I want to highlight here is the issue of the economic crisis. I know this has been tragic for the country, many of the people that I'm sure you know as your neighbors and family. But on the other hand, the one good side of it, it has focused a lot of attention on families and young people making much more deliberate decisions about how they invest their education dollars. I want to say, by way of just sort of context, I have a PhD in Renaissance literature from UC Berkeley. So I'm a big fan of the liberal arts. I don't in any way mean to diminish their importance, but being unemployed and not having a job is a bad thing, and very difficult for human beings in general. Decisions about how to be viable in the economy while they spend their time studying poetry or art or sociology, if they like, seems to be really critical and something many more Americans are beginning to understand. So on that note, we don't have time for questions, I don't think, but I will stop here and hope all of us are ready to learn some new tricks from this vision of what it could look like based on the strong European system. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to chat with you later.
I'm going to use this mic because they're cleaning up over there. But so we're just about ready for our break, and I have to ask, please, for you to come back promptly at 11:30 so we can get started. But we have another panel that's coming up right after break, made up of partnerships between business entities and education agencies, and Bob will moderate that, and he's asked that panelists to meet him down in front at the stage and not take a break. So if our panelists can come down in front, I'll have Bob speak. speak with them. And the rest of you, once again, when you go out the doors here and down the hallway or the restrooms, and then please join us back at 11:30. Thank you.